Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to HOPS Virtual Workshop number 18, I think we're up to. I'm afraid to say that the video equipment has already reported problems broadcasting this evening. Normally it waits until we get a good way into the video before it reports that. So let me know in the comments if you can hear me and if the sound volume is okay, or if it is actually true that we're not broadcasting at all. Don't forget to say hello in the comments. Let us know what organisation you work for. We'll say hello to you. We'll just give everyone a minute or two to arrive, and I'm hoping that somebody in the comments will say that they can actually hear me. Adrian can hear. That's good. Right, let's make a start. Hello everybody, welcome to HOPS Virtual Workshop number 18 on the subject of track safety. Yes, the theme tune is here again. I've got a new little mixing desk this week as well. I've got all the toys to play with. Hello to Adrian from the Chinna and Princess Risborough Railway. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hello Phil. In fact, I've got two Phils, my two favourite Phils, Phil McIver and Phil Summers. Wayne has said there's no sound. This is very interesting. Do let me know what the situation is. Hello Ruth from the Auckland project. You're testing my memory now. Hello Alexander, thank you very much for tuning in. Hello Liz Parks, thank you very much. We'll just give everyone a good minute or so to join and then we'll make a start. Just to remind everyone, this workshop is part of the 2021 series of HOPS Live workshops on the subject of SMSs, safety management systems. We all love them. We're on the, what are we now, the 5th or 6th workshop on the subject of SMSs. This one is going to be a little bit different because the subject matter is too large to fit into one evening, so I'm going to split it up into a couple of different evenings, but I'll explain that in a minute. Weardale Railway, yes Ruth, sorry, that's the railway that you're from, I do beg your pardon. Hello Alan from the Bowness and Kinneil Railway, who says I'm rather quiet. A couple of people have said I'm rather quiet. I'll try and turn myself up a bit. Normally people want to shut me up and make me stop talking. Okay, I'll tinker with the volume a little bit. Let me know if that's any better or any worse, or if I'm blowing your heads off. Right, okay, on we go then. So, if you haven't been tuning into the SMS workshop so far, this is how it works. I do a little speech about whatever the subject matter is based on information that you've sent me in the weeks leading up to the workshop and my experience from the past of working on heritage and mainline railways. But the important thing here is this is not a lecture, this is a workshop, and it's up to you to comment in the comments with what you think. Especially if you disagree with what's being said, so that we can all learn and all benefit from each other. If you're on this workshop and you're thinking to yourself, oh, our SMS is not 100% brilliant, then this is your opportunity to learn from everybody else. And if you're here thinking our SMS is pretty damn good and up to scratch, then this is your opportunity to share some of that with everybody else. And maybe, in fact, you might pick up something that you've never thought of before to include in your SMS. Normal sort of housekeeping. Don't forget all these videos are uploaded to YouTube within a couple of days after they're on Facebook, so you can find them and share them and everything else on YouTube as well, especially if you want to watch them back slowly or compare them to what you've got or just forward them on to other people in your organisation. Usual sort of procedure. As I say, please do join in. This is much more important that you join in than that I join in. It's much more a workshop than it is a lecture. Do share with others, as I've said, and I've already said that the videos are available on YouTube afterwards. The purpose that we're trying to achieve here is to save us all a bit of time and all a bit of cost, because there are 200 and something heritage railways in the UK, and we all require an SMS, and if we're all spending a number of hours coming up with that SMS from scratch, then there is potentially a lot of duplicated work going on, a lot of which we could be clubbing together and sharing a bit of best practice. That's not to say that every SMS is appropriate for every undertaking. You must make sure that what you take away from this is appropriate for your particular railway. We are not saying, underline, that this is what you must do. Apart from the fact that you must have an SMS, this is just one approach that we have come to the conclusion that we might propose as the best practice from all the railways that we've been involved in. But this is just one way of potentially loads and loads of ways to achieve a compliant and as safe as it can be railway. This is just one way to do that. We are not saying that this is guaranteed to be suitable for every undertaking. That's your responsibility to make sure. So I've actually split track safety up into what's going to be 3 workshops, I'm afraid, because lots of feedback says we don't want to listen to you for 2 hours, Danny, and that's absolutely fine. I do maintain that listening to me for 2 hours hopefully saves you time in the long run from spending maybe 5 or 6 hours coming up with it from scratch, but perhaps 2 hours in one night is a little bit much. So I've separated this track safety SMS workshop down into what's going to be 3 sessions, and I hope that they're all going to be shorter than 2 hours. I'll make sure they are. The first session, which is tonight, is going to be my brainstorming session, and whenever I'm writing an SMS document, I always start out with a brainstorm. In no particular order, I just write down all the things that come into my mind on the subject matter that this SMS policy is going to be about. So in the case of track safety, I just got an A4 sheet of paper. I wrote out things like tunnels, limited clearance, protection, tokens, all these different things that I could think of, and then I formulate them out into paragraphs, sort them out into an order that's a bit more intuitive, and voila, that's my SMS document. That's the way I approach it. So tonight is going to be my brainstorming session, and I'm going to tell you all about what I came up with in the brainstorm. It's obviously not going to be complete by any means, but hopefully you're going to contribute into this best practice discussion by telling me where it's not complete, by telling me where you do things differently or better, or other things that need to be considered. I am also aware, of course, that we need to make sure that our SMSs on heritage railways are proportional, and not everything that takes place, for example, on the main line is going to be appropriate to take place on a heritage railway. So I am aware that there are some things where I have simplified deliberately the mainline practice to make it what I believe is appropriate for a heritage railway. In the next session, which is going to be 2 weeks from tonight, it's going to be on Tuesday, oh my gosh, I'm testing myself now, 31st, 30 days, yep, 31st of August, certainly Tuesday, 2 weeks from today, I will deliver an actual PTS briefing as if I was delivering it to a classroom of people, as I have done many times before, and that's going to be an example of the method of delivery of PTS training, which is one of many mechanisms for reducing risk to trackside staff working on the line. Today's going to be the brainstorm and a bit about protection. 2 weeks' time, I'm going to deliver the PTS briefing as if I was delivering it to you, and then on 2 weeks after that, then we'll go through the SMS documents that we have developed as a result of doing these other 2 evenings. So there's no actual SMS for you to see today. There's slides and pictures and things like that, but you get a break from an actual SMS Word document for this week. A couple of assumptions that I've made in the sort of formulation of this brainstorm is, first of all, I'm only considering lines up to 25 miles an hour, and secondly, I'm considering that nearly all heritage railways are single lines between the stations. I'm well aware that there's some railways that can, in certain circumstances, run faster than 25 miles an hour, and I'm also well aware that there are some railways that have sections of double track, either through stations or on actual through the block section. So again, where I refer to maths and sums and sighting distances and things in here, I have tried to highlight it as I go through that I'm working up to 25 miles an hour because I think that's going to cover the vast majority of heritage railways. If you're a railway that runs faster than that, I'm sure that you will already have looked into the safety of trackside staff in order to run faster than 25 miles an hour much more comprehensively than I'm going to be able to get across in a workshop like this. As I said, I've also presumed that heritage railways are generally single lines except in the station areas. Again, if you're a railway that has double track, then there's a lot of extra risk there, and I'm sure you will have considered it. Right, let's take a little bit of a look at safety perception before we go into PTS. And the reason why I've chosen this workshop to talk about safety perception rather than any of the other workshops, which are all obviously rooted in safety, is I think PTS is one of the things, track safety is one of the things that we take for granted, let's say, a little bit on heritage railways. There's definitely a perception that going on the track is almost a right of a heritage railway volunteer because we're not allowed to do it on the main line, but now we volunteer on a heritage railway, yippee, we can walk on the track. And this is about perception. It's certainly not the case that we should accept that just because we volunteer on a heritage railway, therefore we can go and walk on the track. But in some people's minds, that does seem to be the case. This reference about the good old days that I've put on the first bullet point there is the reason why a lot of us volunteer on heritage railways, because we like the steam and we like the heritage rolling stock and the heritage diesels and the old-fashioned way of doing things, the beautiful station buildings, mechanical signalling and points, all that sort of good old days stuff. And it's very easy for the appreciation of that good old days of those good old days assets to accidentally spill over a little bit into safety perception. There is no doubt, and the ORR have made extremely clear, that even though it is a 1940s or 1950s or 60s heritage railway experience, it is 21st century railway safety. And we've got to be willing to make that distinction. Just to give you a little clue, in 1874, which was the oldest year I could find statistics for, 788 railway workers were killed. Not so good old days when you put it in terms of statistics like that. I couldn't find a statistic, but I'm sure that I remember reading in previous years that in the 1950s in Britain, one railway person a week was killed. I couldn't find that to justify it and give you a source, but that's a number that I've had in my head. And if you disagree or you've got a better number or a better source, then please feel free to put it in the comments. Whereas now it is extremely rare. And sometimes a couple last year or the year before, we had 2 at Margam in South Wales, but it's extremely rare now that a railway worker gets killed. And that is because of 21st century railway safety. It's because of the rejection of the old practices of not minimising the risk as far as we possibly can, that the stark statistic comes out that we kill fewer people on railways. Now, again, there are some fair comparisons to be made between what I've just said and heritage railways, and there are some unfair ones. It is not fair to try to reduce heritage railways' ability to affect risk by saying that we're only small railways, because it is a number in the hundreds of heritage railway mileage that there is in the UK. It is not fair to say that we have fewer people, because per full-time equivalent on a heritage railway, there are a lot more volunteers than an actual full-time person working on the main line. So there are some fair comparisons to be made and some that aren't, but the overriding trend is that we used to kill a lot more people and we used to injure a lot more people on railways than we now do. The next thing I want to mention is the working at home versus working on the railway perception. If I was going to, so this is a good example that somebody gave me once. I won't claim it as my own, but it's a good example that somebody gave me. If I was going to clear out the gutters around the roof of my house, I would get my ladder, which is wooden and been lying in the grass all winter and has never had a tag on it in its life, and I would put it up against the house, and I would climb up it, and I'd pull all the leaves out, and I'd probably overstretch myself, and I'd throw them down on the ground. And I'd do that at home, and I think most of us probably would do the same. But if I came into my work, if I worked in a factory or whatever, and my boss told me, climb up this ladder the height of 2 stories and start pulling things out of guttering with no harness, no training, and a ladder that's never been inspected in its life, I would say, I don't think so. I'm not going to do that. That's an unreasonable, unsafe thing for you to ask of me. And quite rightly so. So we have this different perception of safety from working at home to safety from safety from at work. The problem is, volunteering on a railway counts as at work, but in many people's imaginations, it counts as things that you're doing at home. You're giving your personal time, so this surely must be your personal risk. Well, it isn't. It might well be your personal time, but as far as the risk is concerned, it's the railways, your employers, or our employers, to manage. And that applies whether we're a volunteer or an employed member of staff. Another analogy that stuck in my mind that was given to me once was working in the road versus working on the railway. And this applies very neatly to heritage railways because we can say it's exactly the same speed. We can say a car travelling at 25 miles an hour or a train travelling at 25 miles an hour. If you were asked to go and pick up litter out of a road or paint white lines on it or do whatever it is, but you've got to stand in the middle of the road to do it and just dive out of the way of cars as they come along, you'd probably say, absolutely not. I learned ever since I was in primary school or nursery school that being in the road is not a safe place to be. I'm not going to do that job. Whereas it seems that when it comes to volunteering on a heritage railway, the forefoot between the rails is the number one place that everyone wants to stand, chat, have a mobile phone call, sit on the rail to have their lunch. And often the perception is just not there. That although the likelihood of being hit by a train on a heritage railway is much lower, the impact is exactly the same, if not worse than getting hit by a car, but exactly the same as getting hit by a train in any other case. So that's all I wanted to say about safety perception for the moment. Quite often I do get asked, why is it safe to do this thing here and not here? Surely it's either safe or it's not safe. Not just in terms of track safety, but in general. And I try and always get across the idea that there isn't a solid line or a solid definition between what's safe and what's unsafe. A lot of it is about what's reasonably practicable to minimize the risk as far as possible. And if it happens we can minimize it more over there than we can over here, but we're still prepared to accept the residual risk in both cases, then we've done the right thing in both cases. Just because we couldn't reduce it any further here does not mean we should not try to reduce it any further over there. Which brings me on to this heritage versus safety argument. We all know, and I hope we all accept, that we have a decent responsibility to safety in terms of assessing risk and making sure that we reduce it as low as we reasonably can, because we are an employer and our volunteers are our employees as far as health and safety is concerned at least. But we also do recognise that we have a responsibility to heritage, and we don't want to paint the front of steam engines yellow, and we don't want to make everyone wear top-to-toe high-vis the moment they step off the footplate to walk round the engine. And it is a really difficult balance to strike. We have got to, obviously, push it as far towards safety as we can, minimising the detriment on heritage. And there are some very novel solutions out there that I've seen where people have managed to achieve both of those things. We have to ask, what do we need? What do we need in order to make this acceptably safe? Because, of course, we could make the railway a lot safer by never running any trains ever. But that is not an achievable thing for us to do whilst existing. Our raison d'etre is to run steam trains up and down, and around that we have to minimise the risk as far as we possibly can. We also have to think what if. We always should think what if. What if this goes wrong? How easy will it be? How comfortable would I be standing up and saying, this is the process that I put in place and the person stuck to it and yet they still got injured? Or this is the process that I put in place and the process was woolly and so the person didn't stick to it. We should always underline the processes that we invent with thinking, well, no matter how unlikely it is, what would we do if that person still managed to get injured, and how comfortable would we be to defend ourselves? What's going on here? So up to the present day, we accept, or I believe we accept at the moment, that it is reasonably practicable for us to implement measures to prevent, not just to reduce, but to prevent injury to staff working on the track. I think we're in a very strong position to do that, much stronger than on the main line for a number of reasons. I think it would be difficult for us as Heritage Railways to defend a person being injured on the track. First reason I say all this, heritage trains, maximum 25 miles an hour, as far as this discussion is concerned, which means there is more sighting time available, as in the time from the point where you can first see the train until it arrives with you, than there is on the main line. Secondly, we're mostly single lines, according to the assumption for this discussion, which means only one train can approach only one train can approach at a time. I know in station areas it's a bit different, but out in the wilderness on single lines, if a train is approaching you in one direction, you can be sure that a train isn't going to approach you in the other direction. It removes the risk of stepping out behind a train that's gone past you and being hit by one coming in the other direction. Lower train service frequency. Now, you could argue, actually, that increases the risk because people are less prepared for a train to come towards them. But overall I would say the balance is that it decreases the risk having fewer trains. Steam trains are noisier than modern electric or even diesel trains, which makes them easier to hear. And certainly not just the noise of the engine itself, but the hammer blow on the rails. You can hear the rails twanging, of course, as the steam train comes towards you. And I certainly know from experience that modern electric trains, it's really easy for them to creep up on you, and you don't realise until it's too late. We as Heritage Railways operate for limited hours during the day and limited days of the year. So work that it is necessary to go on the line for could potentially be done on days when we're not running trains or during hours when we're not running trains. Again, this is all to be tempered with what's appropriate for your local organisation. Some Heritage Railways run every single day of the year from February to October and then every day in December. And clearly it's a bit more difficult for you to find a day where you can go in and do work when no trains are running. Some Heritage Railways only run certain days of the week or always don't run on certain days of the week, and they're the days to be aiming for, to be getting out and doing the work on the track. Because if we can do it on a day when there's no train running, then we should do it on a day when there's no train running. So you can see there are quite a few opportunities here for us to reduce risk to trackside staff. The other thing is about the balance of risk. If you applied this risk assessment, which is the start of what we're doing now, to a mainline railway, you'd say it's not reasonably practicable to have days where we don't run trains or hours where we don't run trains because we're an essential public service. There's alternative risks to not running trains. People die on the roads, for example. But Heritage Railways are, in most cases, not an essential public service, which makes it more difficult to justify why margins can't be found for people to do work on track when there are no trains running. As I mentioned before, although the likelihood of a Heritage Railway, of getting injured by a train when you're working on the track on a Heritage Railway is less, and I'd be sure that could be verified by statistics, there is no less impact to being injured by a train on a Heritage Railway track. And it can lead to this sort of survival by statistics, I've called it there, whereby it's easy to rest on our laurels, it's easy to become blasé because something doesn't happen very often, and then get caught out massively when eventually it does happen, and the effect is that we weren't expecting it, that we're shocked because we thought we were safe and it turns out that we weren't, and that could have been the case for a very long time. And unfortunately, that is a classic safety scenario on Heritage Railways, that somewhere some guard gets dropped for a little while, there's an incident, then suddenly everything becomes very strong in that safety area, either just on that railway or on all railways, and then next year something else dips a little bit, and it just goes on and on like that. The key thing in terms of the current position for me is that we must always be able to justify how a person is protected. Those ticks are all things that we can use to minimise or to justify the minimisation of the risks we're exposing people to, but we should always be prepared to justify how a person was protected. The what-if scenario: what if that person got injured? What would I say when I'm asked, how were you protecting that person? What measures were in place to minimise the risk to that person? And if the answer to that is nothing at all, we rely on common sense, then that's not going to last very long, I'm afraid. Right, so here's a few things to summarise what I've just said, but in more sort of track-wise format. Track Safety 101, staff only on the line for a legitimate business purpose. That is the first point of the triangle of removing the risk entirely, is if the staff aren't on the track, then they can't be injured by a train coming towards them. If we can't do that, then the best protection to be provided, the best protection for the staff to be provided, and in a minute we'll look at, I don't really want to call it the hierarchy of protection because I think that's been a bit misused, but in a minute we're going to look at protection methods available and which ones are good and which ones aren't. And we should be able to justify why we're not giving the best protection. And it won't always be possible to give the best protection. Sometimes we might, quite often, in fact, we will have to come down to one of the other less robust types of protection. But we should be able to justify why we did that, because if we can't, then we're not doing everything reasonably practicable. If there's no reason why a better method of protection isn't reasonably practicable, then we should be delivering it. So if we can't remove the risk, we'll provide mitigation, and we will also provide mitigation in that staff will be trained, and they will be assessed, and they will be monitored. Training and assessment and monitoring and those sorts of things are deliberately the third bullet point there. The first bullet point is the sort of the best method of managing this risk of staff working on the line side, and when we recognise that sometimes it is necessary for staff to go on the line because it has to be maintained somehow, then we come to the subsequent bullet points and move into providing mitigation instead. Right, let's have a look at some of the areas that there are to work on the line, and the two key areas that we're going to be looking at is the on or near the line definition, which is anything less than 10 feet or 3 meters from the nearest running rail, and the position of safety definition, which is anything 4 feet or more or 1.25 meters or more from the nearest running rail. But this does present some anomalies, especially at 25 miles an hour. Again, I've only concentrated on the definitions here for position of safety up to 25 miles an hour in practice, or in convention rather. They do vary based on the line speed, but up to 25 miles an hour, 4 feet or 1.25 meters. So here's my very nice profile view of the track. There's the track in the middle, 2 tracks with the sleepers and rails, and a cutting of grass on both sides. And you can see a little spike on each grass cutting side, which represents the boundary fence. And I'm sure this is not going to be a surprise to anyone when we go through these definitions, but there's the definition of what on or near the line is, everything up to 10 feet or 3 meters from the nearest running rail, and everything outside of that up to the boundary fence is called on the line side. And I promise I'm not just teaching you how to suck eggs here. There is a reason why I'm going through what the attendees of this call at least might consider fairly basic definitions. There's position of safety for lines up to 25 miles an hour. Everything above 4 feet away from the track is a position of safety, and everything within that range of 4 feet from the track is not a position of safety, position of danger. But this does present this rather interesting little view there that I've highlighted in orange, which is that you can be in a position of safety even though you are on or near the line. So where do we require protecting? Do we require protecting everywhere where we're on or near the line, or do we require protecting on the line side, or do we require protecting when we're in a position of safety? What if I was working in those orange areas? Then I'm on or near the line, but I'm also in a position of safety. As I'm sure you're aware, when a train comes towards me, I shall move to a position of safety. Well, I'm already in a position of safety, so what's the big deal? It gets a bit complicated. So here's my view on the matter, which is that protection is required if you're on or near the line. If you're on or near the line, even if you're in the orange area, even if you're in a position of safety, you are close enough to be at risk, especially when you're working, because it's easy to become distracted and it's easy to take a little step to the left or right, or turn around or swing the shovel around or whatever it is, just at the moment that a train comes along, and bam. It's also close enough for your clothing, or even just the sort of the swoosh of the train going past to catch you out. It's close enough for you to fall over and land in the path of the train. So my view, what I'm going to put up as best practice here, is that a formal method of protection is required if you're working in the definition of on or near the line. But just to confirm, because most railways, in fact I say all railways, every railway should have some sort of training, whether you call it PTS or basic railway safety or any of the other things, the training that you give to members of staff before they're allowed to go on the line applies between the boundary fence. Otherwise, how does somebody know not to stray into that area that's on or near the line? But if I'm working in on the line side, then that's absolutely fine. I can do that. I can trim the grass. That's no problem. I don't need any protection from passing trains. I just need my PTS training to make sure that I understand that on the line side is where I must stay. I do realise that this is a generalised or a simplification, let's say, from what is on the main line, and this is deliberate, where we've narrowed it down into what we found the best practices are from the railways that we work with. And just in case you weren't aware, there's Alan from the HOPS office, 1.25 metres or 4 feet away from the track, standing in his position of safety with his high-vis not done up. Tut tut. Right, so having established where we will need protection, let's now look at the methods of protection. And I should say, sorry, I meant to say before we moved on to this slide, that this protection, this general word I'm using, this formal method of making sure that a person isn't injured by a train applies to every railway. It doesn't matter whether you're a 20-mile long railway or whether you're just a railway round a field, and it doesn't matter whether you're a standard gauge railway or a narrow gauge railway. To a certain extent, it even applies to the miniature gauge railways, because even getting hit by a narrow gauge overscale 7¼ inch train could hurt quite a lot. Again, you'll have to tweak the principles so that they match your particular undertaking, but please don't fall into the trap. Here's the nub of this, is don't fall into the trap of thinking, well, our line is only 500 yards long, or our line is only 15-inch gauge, or any of those things, therefore we don't really need all this. Because remember those analogies, working in the road, cleaning leaves out the gutter of your house, they're all ways in which you can get injured if you apply that sort of I'm at home, I'm taking responsibility for my own risk outlook, rather than I'm an employee, I need to be responsible for my own safety and safeguarding that of my employer here. Okay, sorry, meant to say that on the last slide. So method of protection, here we go. There's a little flow chart. I do like my flow charts, as you know. So the first question in determining what method of protection I'm going to apply is, am I affecting the safety of the line? And the key thing here is, are the passengers going to get injured? And although it may be a little bit a bit unfair to say, but we are a lot more concerned if we're going to be injuring passengers. Railway staff are a bit more adept at jumping out the way. They have training, so they're expecting the train to come towards them, etc., etc. But if we cultivate a situation where the safety of passengers is going to be affected, then we'll find our lives are a lot harder, the risks are a lot higher, and therefore the protection and the mitigation should be a lot stronger. So first of all, am I affecting the safety of the line? Yes. So we're protecting not just the people working on the line, but we're protecting passengers as well. I probably should have put protecting staff and passengers in that box. But the key thing is we're protecting the passengers, or no, we're protecting the railway staff only. Okay, so first of all, you need to decide whether the work you're doing is going to affect the line. I always say, if it's going to affect the integrity of the straight running rails on which a train can run over the top without hitting anything significant enough that it's going to derail, then you're probably not affecting the safety of the line. Yes, there's all sorts of edge cases. You could say if you're working on a set of points and you wind the motor over so the points are half and half, then the train will derail, but we don't consider that we're affecting the safety of the line every time the signalman swings the points from side to side. So you have to apply some judgments to whether the work that you're doing is going to affect the safety of the line or not, and live with it. And that may be something that for regular tasks you want to formalise. So follow the top part of the chart first. If we're protecting passengers, if we are affecting the safety of the line, we've got to protect these passengers. My next question is am I using trolleys only, or have I got trains and plant that I'm going to be using? Because again, this is going to go two ways and it's going to make a difference where we end up. So first of all, if I've got trains in my work that need protecting, then the protection method that we're going to call a possession. That's the word that survived through the centuries, is possession. It's the most risky activities, and therefore it calls for the most robust method of protection, and we'll have a look at the form that takes in a minute. But if I've only got trolleys, which are much less likely to derail a train, and if they do, it's much less likely to be as serious as if a train ploughs into a tamping machine or a ballast train or something like that, then we'll come one down. And this on the main line is called a line blockage with additional protection. It used to be called a T2, and it's the method of protection that's appropriate if we are affecting the safety of the line, but not to the extent of actually using trains in our job. Following the other part of the flowchart, where we're not affecting the safety of the line, so we're protecting railway staff only, the next question I'm going to ask is, are trains still running? We all know that the ideal is no, they won't be, but sometimes it's necessary for them to be. So first of all, if no, trains are not running, then there's several names that this has had over the years. Signal protection is what we're going to call it, which is where the signalman or the signalling equipment shows red, and that is enough to stop the train, to stop it getting to the area where the person needs protection. It's on the main line at the moment called a line blockage. It used to be called a T12, and before that it was, the roughly equivalent thing was a B463. but they're all methods of protecting work that is not affecting the safety of the line, and the work will take place and the work will stop trains running, even if that's only for a couple of minutes, so that the work can take place. And finally, if trains are still running, then this is clearly the most dangerous of the situations, because we need the staff working on the line to move out the way when the train comes along, is the lookout method of protection. And just to sort of elaborate on that, the reason why the first three are coloured in green and the last one is coloured in red is in the first three, we're relying on the system, the overall system of the railway, to not allow trains to enter the area where the work is taking place, to protect that area of work from trains with a system, with some sort of mechanical equipment interlocked to various extents, and in some cases to also protect the surrounding open railway from what's going on in the work. But the bottom one, look out, the staff are going to work on the line, the train is coming, come what may, and we're relying on them to move out of the way when they see it coming into sight. And when I phrase it like that, I hope it makes clear how different lookout protection is from the three above. In some cases, as we'll see, in some cases one person is working out on the line on their own and they're their own lookout, and in some cases there'll be a gang and a person could be specifically appointed to the role of looking out. But in general, that's the breakdown of the four key things that can go on that might need protection. There is one more that sort of lives outside the flowchart, and that's working on vehicles in sidings, which we will also talk about, but it didn't quite fit into the flowchart. Just before we move on to the next slide, there is some opportunity for deviations from this in the Heritage Railway context, particularly if work is taking place and no other movements are taking place. Very different to on the main line, where there's always a passenger train moving around somewhere and there's always some work going on somewhere and they've got to be kept separate. Clearly, if we had a Heritage Railway and both of those things are taking place at the same time, we've got to make sure we keep them separate, but there is some potential to relax here a little bit if the only thing that's going on the line is the work, and it can robustly be assured that passenger trains will not start running while it's going on. Right, let's move on to the next little slide and we'll talk about those four methods of protection in order. So starting with the best one, possession. Remember, this is the one for the protection of railway persons and trains or passengers. It's for work that affects the safety of the line, for use with trains and plant in the work. There is a big collision risk here between trains that are running around with the passengers in and trains that are taking place in the work. And there's also a runaway risk that we have to consider, such as if a road rail machine or something like that rolls away within the possession. Now, it's not always possible to mitigate every single risk, of course, but we have to do our best to minimize these as far as possible. So we'll try and provide some sort of protection both for the work and the staff in the possession and the trains, and for the trains on the open railway outside. So for these types of things, as well as protection by signals, as well as having to have a mechanism for guaranteeing that signals are at danger, which could be verbal agreement with the signalman, we need some additional means. And following on my generalisation that most heritage railways are single lines, most of those single lines are worked by either electric token block or train staff and or ticket. And so the person in charge of the work taking custody of a token or the staff is a fairly decent means of protecting a possession. It's such a decent means, in fact, that it is accepted as a means of protecting a possession on the main line. So it's definitely good enough for us as a heritage railway. Although we've spoken before about some protection measures on the main line are not suitable for heritage and some on heritage are not suitable for main line, the fact that a driver must not go into the section without a token is sufficiently robustly ingrained in the heritage railway world, as much as it is on the main line, that taking possession of a token is a fairly good way of making sure that no other trains come and join you in the section. As I already mentioned, it is both the possession and the open railway that require the protection. My next bullet point, I'm pretty sure, is going to be controversial, where I've said that detonators not appropriate, especially for single lines. So here's the thing, and I know that there's different views on this. Here's my view, you can take it or leave it, is that detonators are expensive. They're expensive to maintain, they're expensive to store. It is not appropriate for people to be wandering around with detonators all the time, and they have to be replaced and disposed of properly. On predominantly single line railways where it is not necessary to protect the adjacent line in an emergency, the justification for carrying detonators around in guards' bags and on locomotives and clipped to the block shelf in signal boxes and things like that rapidly diminishes. Think of the what if scenario. What if somebody got injured by one of them? And I imagine that you'd come to the conclusion that you'd find it difficult to justify why they had them in the first place, and why they weren't in the proper container, and all those sorts of things. Now, I know that some railways have double track, some railways work on the main line, so you have to carry detonators anyway. That's all fine. I just thought I'd put it in there to provoke the discussion, because detonators have in the past been used to protect possessions. I don't think detonators are an appropriate method of protection on a heritage railway for protecting possessions where other equally robust protection measures are available that don't have all those risks associated with putting detonators out. And finally, a human interlocking is not acceptable for this type of protection of work, this possession. We can't just rely on the signalman to keep a reminder collar on a lever, for example, whereas with other methods of protection we can, because here we're protecting the trains and passengers, and because of the seriousness of the work that's going on in the possession, it's involving ballast trains or tamping machines or things like that. We need something better than just a human protecting the work, such as the token, for example. One that I didn't mention there, and it isn't used in this context on the main line, but it's appropriate enough for a heritage railway, is disconnection of a signal or signalling equipment, so that even if a human makes a mistake and forgets or misunderstands where the work is or any of those things, the system will then stop them operating the equipment. So I didn't include that, but human interlocking not acceptable for this level of risk. Thank you very much to Liz in the comments, who says maybe work on the outside of trains is a subset. Yes, absolutely, because you could almost certainly say that all of the four main types that I have also apply to working on vehicles in sidings, protecting the safety of the line, not affecting the safety of the line, those sorts of things. And Liz has also said Network Rail is phasing out detonators too. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's a very interesting thing, because obviously a lot of Network Rail is double or more track. My comment, a lot of the thought process behind my comment was that most heritage railways are single lines, so it's not as necessary to protect the adjacent line in an emergency. But I guess since, 10 years ago we got GSMR, that's a more effective, more expedient means of protecting the line in an emergency than detonators would ever have been. So maybe that's the rationale. Interesting. Thank you very much. Right, final couple of things on possessions is arrangement should be written. Arrangement should be written, and I can think of two good reasons why arrangement should be written. One is because it's very easy for verbal misunderstandings to take place. Oh, yep, all right, I'm working in the same place as I did yesterday. Yep, no problem, thanks, bye. And that person wasn't actually on yesterday, or the person didn't really truly understand, but they didn't want to look silly, so they didn't challenge it, and a misunderstanding occurs. The written arrangements do not need to be hundreds of pages, and most railways make do with a single sheet of A4 that says, for example, name, date, name of person in charge, which you might call a PICOP, a person in charge of possession, or you might call it something else, it doesn't really matter. Name, telephone number, and clear identification in terms of points or signals between which the line is blocked, from signal number 3 to signal number 22, or from point 6 to the buffer stops, or whatever it's going to be, that it is written out, because then it has to be verbally dictated. You know that both parties are working to the same arrangements. And the second reason why I say it's written is because then there's a nice audit record afterwards to make sure that if something has gone a little bit wrong, what was actually agreed, what did each party believe. You can audit this to make sure that it is being conducted properly, and you can use it as part of competence evidence. And speaking of competence, good old competence, the person who's going to be in charge of this possession, whatever you call it, needs some official competence to do so. And throughout this, I've used red text for the where competence is required. On the main line and throughout heritage, in fact, the person in charge of a possession has been called a A PICOP, a person in charge of possession. There's a bit more of a detailed structure to it, so I'll just very briefly run through the mainline scenario, but most of this isn't appropriate to heritage, that there's a PICOP in charge of the whole possession, there's work sites within the possession, each one is controlled by an engineering supervisor. I have found that 99% of possessions on heritage railways manage perfectly well with a PICOP because there's generally only one gang working in them. If there's two gangs working in them, then generally the PICOP is one of those gangs and he sort of subcontracts it to the other gang as well. It's only really, in my experience, the really serious relaying job, 3-week-long possessions, taking bridges out, things like that, where it's necessary to have more layers of control over the work that's going on than just the PICOP and the people on the ground. So you can make of that what you like, and you can decide what types of possession from none to all require this level of engineering supervisor in the middle. It does make, probably more complicated than it wants to be on a heritage railway, the communication protocol from signalman to PICOP to engineering supervisor to person working on the track. As I say, for 99% of possessions on heritage railways, the PICOP and the signalman can agree the arrangements, and then the PICOP and his gang can start the work. Right, on to the next type of protection, which years and years ago would have been called protection of trolleys on lines not under possession, maybe protection of work on lines not under possession. This is the one where we are affecting the safety of the line, but we don't want to go to the extent of a full possession. We're not going to have any trains. It's slightly less risk, but nevertheless we are still affecting the safety of the line. So this one, if you remember, is for the protection, same as last time, of both railway persons and trains and passengers. It's for work affecting the safety of the line for use with trolleys or other rail-mounted equipment with less collision or runaway or derailment risk than a full-blown train or machine. It's protected by signals and additional means, such as a token. Oh, I mentioned disconnection here on this one. Again, human interlocking not acceptable. Again, detonators not appropriate. Written arrangements for both parties. And competence for the PICOW. Now, PICOW, person in charge of work, modern day equivalent, controller of site safety costs. Again, you can call it whatever you like. PICOW is the slightly older term. You might notice that this slide is extremely similar to the previous one, and yes, that's because it is. So what I've written on this work protection of work on lines not under possession slide pretty much mirrors the main line, whereas the previous one, remember we talked about these additional layers of control in the possession which we didn't really want on a heritage railway. Well, that's because our heritage railway possessions are generally not complicated enough to need them, and if you take them out, what you end up with is almost the same as this protection of work on lines not under possession. And I have had discussions before where we've sort of discussed around the subject of should we keep them as two separate things or should we make them all one thing, and we've concluded let's keep them as two separate things so that we can have two separate teams of people that can manage them, because managing the risk associated with taking a ballast train or a tamping machine into a possession and dealing with it to make sure that it doesn't run things over or run away or exceed the movement that it's supposed to take has more risk to it and requires a more robust level of management than protection of trolleys on lines not under possession, because they are less risk. So we can have this competence for a PICOP who's allowed to control engineering work with trains, and we can have a competence for a PICOW, which is a slightly lesser level of competence that probably more people can have, which means they can just push a trolley up and down the line with the associated less risk that imports. So those were the two methods of protection for affecting the safety of the line. Now let's have a look at methods of protection for work that does not affect the safety of the line. So first of all, if trains are going to continue to run, we've got this good old signal protection. This is just the human interlocking, nothing else at all. This is for the protection of railway persons only, persons working on the track. It's for work not affecting the safety of the line, and that's because we're going to be relying on just signals, just the signalman remembering not to pull that lever or remembering to keep that reminder appliance on the button. That a mistake could potentially be made and a train could come into the area that's being signal protected. As we say, it's not nice to suggest that we just run the railway staff over without caring, and that's certainly not the case, but railway staff are a bit more ready to jump out of the way than a ballast train or a tamping machine is. So signal protection is protected by signals and the signalman and driver discipline, such as keeping that reminder appliance in place, and in terms of the driver obeying the red signal and stopping at it. Again, written arrangements for both parties, and the arrangements are pretty similar, who the person is, and if they've got a mobile phone, that's probably a good idea, and an exact understanding of which section of line between points and signals that everybody knows exactly where they are is going to be blocked. I would not suggest for a moment that a verbal agreement is good enough, apart from in an emergency, of course, and I'm sure we all know that all of these things that we all say in an emergency, we do the most appropriate thing. If a person has fallen off a platform and injured themselves and is lying on the track, clearly a telephone call to the signalman to block the line, starting with the words, "This is an emergency call," and explaining the circumstances, reaching that clear understanding verbally is completely appropriate in that circumstance. Whereas jumping down to, repair a fish plate bolt or whatever, which is not urgent and not an emergency, there is time to dig into your bag and find your signal protection agreement, arrangements form, or whatever it is you want to call it, so that you can confirm that both sides have reached an understanding. And in some cases, at this point, people go, "Oh my God, that'll take forever. Filling out a bit of paper just to go on the line, that's ridiculous." Well, yes, it is going to take time. And I always say, good, it makes you stop and think and actually work out what you want and then explain it to another person and make them understand. If that takes longer than it would have done to do it verbally, that's because when you were doing it verbally, you weren't reaching that clear understanding. And I know that's possibly, not 100% true, because I can probably talk faster than I can write, but I would far rather have staff that instead of spending 30 seconds explaining it to the signalman verbally, spend a minute writing it out and explaining it to the signalman verbally, for the massive increase in likelihood that they're going to reach a clear understanding that brings. Right, and the fourth and final of the main part of the flowchart options is lookout. And if you remember, this one was coloured red. This is the one that's the worst of all, but sometimes is unavoidable, where trains are going to continue to run whilst the staff work on the line. And remember how I worded it, the staff are on the line, the train is coming, come what may, and it's just up to the staff to move out of the way before it gets there. Where on earth else in the railway do we give the train authority to move and then just rely on the fact that we'll make it safe before the train gets there? Almost nowhere else. Is there AHB crossings? Maybe. But on the railway, we're all obsessed with safety, quite rightly, and we say we'll make it safe and then we'll do the thing. We'll close the doors and then we'll dispatch the train. We'll set the points and put the FPLs in and then we'll clear the signal. We don't ever say we'll dispatch the train and then we'll run along and slam all the doors and we'll hope that we manage to do it before it pulls away. We would never dream of doing that. But here we are, allowing people to go out onto the line. Then we'll send the train and see how many of them it can knock over like Skittles, or if they manage to jump out of the way before it arrives. And the only reason that we have to accept that and that we have to do it is because there's no other reasonably practicable option for some work, is there? We can't do all work when there's no trains running. We have to do some work when there is trains running. And that's why this method of protection requires the most in the way of mitigation and absolute robust procedures, because it is the one where we're exposing ourselves to the most risk. For the protection of railway persons only, which means you know what the next bullet point is going to be, it's for work that does not affect the safety of the line. And there is there's not a huge amount of heavy work that can be done with lookouts, because obviously you've got to be able to stop it and move it out of the way in time when a train comes into view. It is, as I've said many times now, the members of staff's responsibility to move out of the way. That is the size of it. There are some prerequisites here then, of course. We've got to have sufficient time here. I know that time comes from the distance of visibility, but we've got to be able to give these staff sufficient time to move out of the way between them becoming aware of the fact that a train is coming and the train actually arriving where they would otherwise be in a position of danger. I'm not, incidentally, going to give any thought whatsoever here to the fact that because trains go slower, the chances are they might be able to stop before they reach the gang. And I'm not going to do that for two reasons. One is, in many cases, that's not possible with curvature and gradient and all those sorts of things and, line-side vegetation. But also, if you put yourself in the position of the driver and you see a gang on the line a mile ahead and you know it takes you 400 yards to stop, at what point do you start braking? Do you start braking a mile away, half a mile away, 400 yards away, 300 yards away? Almost because our trains run slower than mainline trains, there's a lot more seconds in 400 yards for a heritage railway train than there is on a mainline train. So it makes it very difficult for us to prescribe to a driver, when should you start to brake if you see a gang working on the line ahead? And inevitably, the human brain would leave it too late. So we're not going to give any relaxation of the risk here to the fact that the trains run more slowly, and therefore, in many cases, probably could stop before they reach the gang, but you can't guarantee it. Oh, I'm seeing video lost. This isn't good. Let's see whether you're still here. Oh, you're back. Right. Sorry, I don't know if I went away for a moment there. As always, my video is not 100%. Okay, I'm sure you'll soon let me know if you can't hear me one way or another, but I'm going to carry on. Right, so where are we? Here we are. Right, this is a human method of interlocking. I haven't put it on the board there because actually there is no interlocking in terms of signal levers or reminder appliances or anything like that. But this is an example of human interlocking. I shall do these last two bullet points in the wrong order. A competence is required for somebody who's going to act as a lookout. There is no doubt a competence is required. Training, assessment. Lookout is one of the most serious jobs that you can possibly have on the railway. The only thing stopping those members of staff getting run over is the correct behaviour and activity of the lookout, and therefore as managers of railways, that is one of the roles that we want to make the most sure has been trained and assessed, and we can demonstrate they knew what they were doing. And competence for the pike-owl or whoever's going to be in charge of the gang that's protected by the lookout. There's got to be some competence there as well. We can't have a gang of people going out, somebody being the lookout, and nobody sort of arranging it. Somebody has got to be in charge of making sure that the gang know that the lookout is going to be the one to give them the warning, what the method of the warning will be, the fact that the lookout can see in every direction, all those sorts of things. It's very difficult to imagine a circumstance where somebody isn't in charge of that. The lookout and the pike-owl could be the same thing, of course. Again, depending on the type of work and the risk of the pike-owl becoming distracted by the work is definitely something, but I'm certainly not going to say in all cases it can't be done. I would say certainly in a heritage railway context it can be done, but we need some competence there so that we can demonstrate the person in charge of the gang knew what they were doing. And the second to last bullet point, if you've heard of distant and intermediate lookouts, then just forget it on a heritage railway. That is too many links in the chain of what is, in many cases, volunteers who don't do the job very often, are not used to the risks and responses that are required from doing this every day, such as somebody who does it for their full-time job. There's extremes of ages. There's all sorts of risk heightening factors to working on an open line, and for what I think, lookout is as fair as I'm prepared to take it. A person standing at the site looking in both directions. A distant lookout is if you can't see far enough, then you provide somebody a little bit further down the track who can see round the corner, and they wave a flag, and then the site lookout sees it and warns the gang. And intermediate lookouts is having a person in between those two because maybe the curvature is really tight and even two can't see. And potentially that in the other direction as well. You can very quickly start to see how many links in the chain need to take place in order for the people working to move out the way. The distant lookout's got to see the train, he's got to signal to the intermediate lookout lookout's got to signal to the site lookout's got to tell the gang. It's far too much to go wrong, and I would say that in our context of a heritage railway, if we need that many lookouts to do this job, cancel the train, because no one is going to be late for work because we didn't run a train on a heritage railway. A comment has just been said in the comments, as trains are regularly signalled into line blockages on the main line by full-time professional signalmen, and the staff in those scenarios are sadly no longer expecting trains to approach. On a heritage railway where staff wages aren't a limitation, surely lookouts are far safer. Oh, okay, fair enough. As a signalman, I would never rely on a signalman to protect me. Always assume a train can approach. We're not superhuman. Yes, and to a certain extent, that is reflected in the risk, where if a signalman or another member of staff makes a mistake and can cause a train to go into into some work where the safety of the line is not affected, clearly that's much less risk than if they're going into a site where the safety of work is affected. But it is exactly true to say that a signalman can make a mistake just as much as any other human being. Yeah, I can't say any more than that. Right, where have we got to with this? So I've done some more work on lookout for you. Sorry, I'll go back a slide just to confirm there's all the things to do with lookout. So now we're going to concentrate on this sufficient visibility aspect of it, because I've done some lovely maths for you. A sighting calculation is required. There is no way in the world that you'll be able to justify the lookout had adequate sighting if you can't state what that sighting should have been. So here is, again, copied from the sort of mainline context, but irrelevant bits for heritage railways moved out. So we're going to add together all these times and we're going to work out how much sighting we need. So time to down tools, 5 seconds. And you might say, gosh, I can put a tool down in 1 second. Yes, but sometimes it might be a bit more complicated. In an edge case scenario, let's say the worst case to down tools is going to be 5 seconds. And let's agree that we've got to do all this on the worst case, because otherwise that one time when the worst case comes up and it takes 5 and you've only allowed 1, it's game over. Time to move to a position of safety. Now, as long as there is a position of safety adjacent to where you're working, and if you're working on a single line, as we've established most heritage railways are, again, 5 seconds probably adequate. Add 5 seconds if one person is looking out both ways. And that's because if they've got to keep looking up, down, up, down, up, down. In so many human nature, they're not going to do it that fast for the whole day. It could be 5 seconds of looking in one direction before they happen to look in the other direction. And the train could have come into view in that direction 5 seconds before they looked. So we've already lost 5 seconds of the train coming towards us if the person is looking out both ways. Just in case you're comparing this to the mainline stuff where extra seconds are added for distant and intermediate lookouts, we've said distant and intermediate lookouts not appropriate on a heritage railway. Add 5 seconds if working alone, because there is much more opportunity to become distracted by the task that you're doing if you're working alone. And then finally, add 10 seconds, which is the minimum time to be in a position of safety, certainly on the main line and fairly conventionally accepted everywhere else. That means that you've got this 10-second contingency at the end, because, of course, in theory, you're safe if you're in a position of safety for 1 second before the train arrives. But 10 seconds is much more comfortable, much less panicky, much less of a close shave, but still gives you 9 seconds of contingency. So in the worst case scenario, what's that? 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds warning time in the worst case scenario. And here's some lovely charts that I've made for you. The top one is in miles an hour, and then I know some railways work in meters rather than yards, sorry. So I've done it in meters as well. So reading in the yellow across the top, if the line speed is, I went 10, 15, 20, 25. Underneath that is what that equivalent is in yards per second. And then down in the green on the side is how many seconds warning you've worked out you'd need. And then how many yards of sighting that you need in order to achieve that. And so 25 miles an hour at 30 seconds, 367 yards is quite a long distance. And I'm sure there's lots of locations on heritage railways where, due to the curvature of the line and bridges and tunnels and vegetation and all sorts of other things, that 367 yards is not available. So it is easy to think that we can always survive with a lookout. A lookout will always do, but sometimes it won't necessarily do. I put those 4 methods of protection really in order of risk to the railway. Would have probably been a better way for me to describe it rather than robustness of protection. Hopefully we've mirrored the robustness of the protection for the risk to the railway. but it won't always be possible to freely pick which one you want to apply if you haven't got 367 yards of sighting distance in both directions, let's not forget. Phil has said that 5 seconds is a very short amount of time when doing a task, especially if there is a train coming towards you. I would rather be in a position of safety for a full minute or two before a train passes. Yeah, absolutely right. I do agree. I took those seconds. Let me go back a page. I took those seconds from the equivalent main line. What we just have to be careful of is if, for example, we prescribed that somebody must be in a position of safety for a full minute or two before the train passes, we massively reduce the locations where working with lookout can be accommodated. What I would say, though, is if you happen to have 2 minutes of sighting, the moment you see the train, give the warning and stand in a position of safety for 2 minutes. Not acceptable to say, well, I can see it's still 2 minutes away, so I'll wait till it gets until it's 30 seconds away and then I'll give the warning because I know I only need 30 seconds of warning. That would be difficult to justify why we wasted all that time of the train coming towards us before moving into a position of safety. Liz has pointed out that the ORR is against unassisted lookout. Yes, it is. That is very true. There are, without wishing to sort of be political about it, but there are certainly advantages and disadvantages to all of these types of method of working. And some of those advantages and disadvantages apply differently based on what risk you're accepting as a result of it. So whether you're working on the track or whether you're the lookout or whether you're the signalman or the railway manager or the ORR, different levels of risk are going to come your way with different methods of protection. So it certainly has to be balanced. Right, and then there's a load of comments about line blockages, which I'm not going to get into. Right, so there's the warning time. Same below for if your railway is measured in metres, which I know some railways are because I had to amend the asset management system in order to accommodate them. But I'm pretty sure you still measure speed in miles an hour. I'm sure if you measure speed in kilometres an hour, you'll be able to make an equivalent chart, or if not, give me a ring and I will cook one up for you. So that's the equivalent metres per second for each of those speeds in miles per hour. Warnings time down the side, and the sighting required in metres in the grey. Right, and then our fifth one that appeared slightly outside the flowchart, working on vehicles in sidings. This is a slightly more difficult one to manage because sidings are generally less controlled, let's say, than running lines. There is a risk to people working on vehicles in sidings from movements within the sidings. There's a risk from movements entering the sidings and buffering up. And it's not always 100% easy to control. But the not to be moved board is our friend. Clipping up points and providing stop boards is our friend. It's just a little bit less rigid and a little bit less definable, I think. So here's my view on what I think happens, which I think is a good practice, which is if no or no other traction units are in the siding, then either clip up the points, because that will stop another movement coming into your siding, or provide a stop board, a sort of a flashing red thing that clips onto the rails if you've got them. And that is appropriate if you only want to close part of the siding, if you don't want to clip up the points and close the whole siding, or if there are no appropriate points for you to clip up, such as if it's the siding that is the continuation of the end of the running line. Little thing about stop boards is, of course, you could put one on, somebody else could come along and want to do some other work, and they might say, oh, there's already a not to be moved board on, so I won't bother to put my one on. Then you finish your work and take your not to be moved board off, and suddenly they're working without protection. So really, we do need some mitigation against that. I've seen some railways apply the rule that it's one stop board each, and you can only take off the stop. Sorry, I didn't mean to say stop board there. I meant to say not to be moved board. It's either one not to be moved board each, and so if there's two gangs working, there'll be two not to be moved boards on the train, and you only take your own one off. Or that you can apply little keyring tags to the bottom of the not to be moved board, and if you put it on, you put your own tag on, somebody else comes along and wants to share it, they put their tag on, and then if you come back to the not to be moved board and find somebody else has put their tag on it, you take yours off, you take your tag off, but leave the not to be moved board where it is. The other person comes back, they see that they're the last person on the not to be moved board and take their tag off and take the not to be moved board off. These are all just different variations of methods of protection that we've seen over time. Obviously, with all of these methods of protection, you will apply what is prescribed in your rulebook, but for the purpose of this, we're discussing what could potentially go in the rulebook. If there are traction units in the siding, then not to be move board to be placed on the traction unit. So if somebody comes up and starts it up, then they don't buffer up to the stock or whatever it is that you're working on. In some railways, I've seen that this also applies to platform lines, such as out of hours, so that when there is no signalman or when the railway is not operating, the carriage and wagon staff can come along and do the exams on the carriages parked in the platform lines without having to book a signalman on, just to provide the signal protection and then go home again, which clearly is not going to be very practicable on a heritage railway. Arrangements like this should obviously be locally specified. If they're not in the rulebook completely, then they should be in sort of the local instructions. Right, excellent. And of course, my favourite word, competence, is that for people who are going to be applying this method of protection, there must be a competence for them. All these competencies don't have to be 500 pages long, by the way. The competence for working on vehicles in sidings can be really simple. It's the person understands the method of when to put a not to be moved board on, when to put a tag on, when to take it off, when to clip up points, when to put a stop board on. They're the sort of things. If the siding is controlled by a signalman, that they have to ring up the signalman and ask permission first. It's not going to be more than 8 or so points on the assessment criteria sheet to be competent to work on vehicles in sidings, and not very much, not a huge amount more than that for the other things that we've talked about, like pie cow and lookout and those sorts of things, but we've got to have something. Right, last few little things then. Work arrangements. There's 2 options here. You're either working on your own or you're working in a gang. If you're working in a gang, somebody must be in charge of it. So good old competence. There must be a competence for the pie cow. We've already established, could also be called a ganger. Same thing, really. And if you're working alone, then there should really be a competence for working alone to make sure that you understand the parts of the pie cow's job that apply to you still while you're working alone. Again, they don't have to be hundreds of pages long. They can be 1 A4 sheet, but we should have something to prove that we've trained the people in the risks that they're going to encounter so that they mitigate them. We can't get round this. You can't get round this by saying, oh, no, we're 10 people going out as individuals. We're not in a gang. Obviously, that's not the intention of the rule, so stop it immediately. And PTS, finally, as we mentioned right at the start, some sort of personal track safety or basic railway safety or whatever you want to call it that explains this stuff to staff. And that's what we're going to be doing 2 weeks from today when I deliver you my imaginary PTS briefing, and you can steal whatever bits out of it you like and reject whatever bits out of it you like. Right, here's a controversial subject, high visibility clothing. And if you watch Countdown, you'll see that Sean Locke on Countdown made some low visibility clothing by getting a tabard and putting a picture of a railway on it, which I always thought was quite funny. Right, high visibility clothing. So here's the thing, nobody wants to wear it because it's heritage, or rather we're in a heritage environment and it's not heritage. But if you look on the mainline railway, everyone is dressed top to toe in it. So there must be a middle ground here somewhere. You can't say, I'm not going to say somebody's right and somebody's wrong because it's different mitigations for different circumstances, but there's some huge variations. So the first thing I'll mention is none of the methods of protection that we've mentioned so far have relied on high-vis clothing. They've all relied on systems, they've relied on interlocking, they've relied on verbal communication, they've relied on lookouts seeing when a train is coming towards them, but none of them so far have relied on high visibility clothing. So why on earth do we need it? Right, well, it's the last resort, isn't it? High visibility clothing is the last resort for if all of those other methods of protection fail, the driver sees the high visibility clothing, blows the whistle, the staff working on the line hear the whistle, which again, no method of protection so far that we've discussed has relied on people hearing anything, and then they move out of the way. So it's the last resort only. It's if everything else fails that the high visibility clothing is necessary. It's if all those other systems that we've put in place have for some reason allowed a train to slip through the net, the high visibility clothing will allow the driver to see us, blow the horn, we'll hear them and we'll move out the way. That's like a 3-step back and forth process in order to achieve safety there, and that's why it's the last resort. There are two other reasons why I always say why we wear high visibility clothing on heritage railways. One is it clearly identifies who is legitimately on the track and who isn't, or in most cases, I'm sure somebody, if they wanted to, could put on a high vis and go for a walk, but it's very clear to see if somebody is not wearing a high vis, they're not on the line, and if somebody who either accidentally or deliberately claims they don't understand whether they're allowed on the line or not sees somebody else walking on the line and they've got they've got high vis clothing on, it's very easy to discern that that person is intending to be there, whereas somebody walking around without high vis clothing on is much more likely to induce other people to do the same. And the third reason for high visibility clothing is a discipline reason, for the same reason that armies wear uniforms and school children wear uniforms, is if you dress a member of staff up in a high visibility clothing with a railway logo on it, and it's clear they're a member of staff and they feel like they're a member of staff and they recognise that they're part of this team that's all wearing the same clothing, they are much, much more likely to behave in the way that we want them to behave, in a safety-conscious way, than if everyone just turns up in whatever clothing they like and some people don't wear a shirt at all. That breeds a much more sort of I'm doing whatever I like type approach. The same reason that schools have non-uniform days only very rarely. It's like a privilege to not wear a uniform because you're being allowed to express your individuality and be encouraged to do what you like, but it makes it a nightmare to manage discipline in the school. For the rest of the time, you all have to wear your school uniform. There is lots of arguments about how much high visibility clothing should be worn. So again, the best thing that we've managed to come up with is that if you're on an authorised walking route, that is a path that is defined in some sort of list of authorised walking routes on your railway, then a mini vest is okay. If you're outside of the station area walking along the line, walking, working, patrolling, inspecting, examining, then a full vest. And if you're out in foul weather, then trousers as well. Two reasons for trousers in foul weather. One is because it's more difficult for the driver to see you in foul weather. So if you're using orange trousers as well, that's more surface area of orange for them to see. But also, separately from the visibility element of high-vis clothing, PPE also exists for other reasons as well, and stopping people getting all wet and cold and hypothermia when they're working out in foul weather is PPE that we should be providing for them. So even though the purpose of the clothing being high visibility is to assist in visibility, it does have other useful purposes as well, such as protecting people from the foul weather and keeping them warm. Reflective stripes. I've seen different approaches to reflective stripes. To be honest, it's pretty difficult to get high-vis clothing without the reflective stripes on nowadays, but we could justify by saying if it's in daylight, maybe we don't need the reflective stripes, but any time when it's not daylight, and that's not just complete darkness, but as it starts to get dark, reflective stripes required. Obviously, that does rely on there being a headlight on the front of the engine to a certain extent, and some engines have them and some engines don't. But again, I'm just applying the what if here. What if somebody got injured? The lack of reflective stripes would definitely be an opportunity for somebody to say we weren't doing everything reasonably practicable, because it is reasonably practicable to provide the stripes. And finally, on the subject of high visibility clothing, this heritage atmosphere that we referred to earlier, and I do recognise that we are trying to recreate a heritage experience, and having people wandering around in high vis clothing does not always create that heritage atmosphere. But we have to make sure that where we give these sort of relaxations to what we've, everything we've said above, that we can justify them. So two places where we definitely see relaxations to the requirement to wear high visibility clothing. One is footplate crew attending to their engine. So not just wandering around everywhere, but footplate crew attending to their engine. And the rationale that we can give for that is that certainly one of the lines adjacent to where those footplate crew are wandering around has got their engine on it, and they know they're not about to move it because they're the driver. And also that generally footplate crew... how to word this. Footplate crew are familiar with the movement of trains on other lines because they routinely drive them on other lines. And they're familiar with where it's difficult to see people on the line and where it's easy to see people, and it's easy to justify that a footplate crew member, because they see it from both sides, is a little bit more likely to remain in a safe position. One that's not mentioned up there is yards. So depending on the nature of the frequency of movements in yards, Sometimes it's appropriate to say high-vis clothing not required. Sometimes it isn't. Certainly in like train preparation areas over pits and things like that, most railways say high-vis clothing not required there. Out the front of the shed maybe, where engines are whizzing in and out, or maybe propelling movements take place, then maybe that's not appropriate. And so maybe some sort of boundary is required to say, well, you don't have to wear high-vis clothing up to that fence there, and then after that you do. And token duties is the other place where we tend to see relaxations from the requirement, or what would otherwise be a requirement to wear high visibility clothing. Signalmen out doing token duties. The positions from which signalmen do token duties are generally pretty well defined, and certainly remain constant in practice. So train crew are expecting to find a member of staff there, not least of all because they've got a token they want to give them or one they want to get from them. So it is possible to justify a reduced risk for signalmen undertaking token duties from the high visibility clothing requirement. Right, last couple of slides on the subject of track safety. Our good old friend, the limited clearance sign, where a position of safety is not available in front of a line-side structure. Let's stick one of those red and white signs on it, because we've told everybody they must stand in a position of safety when a train comes along. Let's help them to identify where we have put something where the position of safety does not exist. And I've put any structure then closer than 5 foot to the running rail, because obviously a position of safety is 4 foot and a person takes up roughly a foot. So if it's closer than 5 feet, then you can't really stand in front of it and be in a position of safety. We asked what are staff expected to do with this information. They're expected to know that they can't stand in front of, in this case, that loke, and still think they're in a position of safety. If a limited clearance sign is applied to an extremely long structure, then we expect staff to look at it and go, oh, well, there's limited clearance. There's no position of safety for the entire length of this structure. And I don't think, based on the visibility that I've got enough time to get past the structure and be in a position of safety on the other side of it for 10 seconds before a train potentially arrives, in which case you shall not pass. On the mainline railway, there's a subject called the red zone band areas. This is areas where you're not allowed to be when trains are still running because there is no position of safety over a significant area. Personally, when I implemented that on a heritage railway, I just called it restricted work areas because I thought that told the story a little bit better than having to introduce what a red zone area was. But I think more heritage railways than we perhaps recognise have areas where there is no position of safety over a distance longer than you could get out of that area and be in a position of safety before a train arrived. And there is no excuse. People should not be working in those areas when trains are still running because they can't comply with the requirement to get into a position of safety. So we can help them by identifying where those locations are, publishing them in the map, and saying you cannot work here unless you've got one of the other methods of protection. Similar to the red and white Battenberg is the blue and white. For no refuges, applicable in places only where refuges would normally be expected, such as tunnels and viaducts and bridges. And what are staff expected to do with this information? Well, they're expected to not rely on the fact that there will be a refuge for them to dive into. They've got to be confident that they can clear whatever the structure is and be in a position of safety on the other side of it for 10 seconds before a train comes, and if they don't think they can do that based on the sighting distance that's available, then they can't go onto the structure. Quite often, although there's no refuges on one side, there might well be refuges on the other. In fact, if there is no refuges on the other, then you could argue it's actually limited clearance rather than no refuges. And last in my slides of my brainstorm, this was all my brainstorm that I did for the SMS document on track safety, is tunnels. In some cases, some railways have single bore tunnels, where obviously if you're in the tunnel, you are on the line. And in some cases, what were previously double line railways that have now been turned into heritage railways have tunnels, and there's a lot more there's a lot more opportunities to be in the tunnel but not in a position of danger. However, that's a risky business in the context of a heritage railway, and I suspect we should really be saying that if you're in the tunnel, you've got to be sure that there's going to be no train passing, which I know is different to the heritage aspect, but is it really a risk that we can justify taking in the context of a heritage railway? So can sighting be maintained before entering the tunnel and throughout? If the tunnel is only 10 yards long and you can see a mile down the track through the tunnel before you even go into it, then you do have time to walk through the tunnel and be out the other side and in a position of safety for 10 seconds at least before the train arrives. Benefit there of being a heritage railway and running at a low speed. But if not, then you can't go through the tunnel. That would be exactly what I would say. I'm not going to hold with the idea of staff going into the tunnel in the dark, and even if we believe that there is a position of safety or refuges in the tunnel, just because the risk is too great that they'll fall over, or the crew will get panicked when they see the torches, or the train crew, that is, or anything like that. It's just not worth it. Right, also consider risk arising from lone working if people are going to be going into tunnels. We talked about lone working a couple of weeks ago. Make sure that if a lone worker is lone working full stop, they should be signed into the lone working register, and particularly heightened lone working risks if you're expecting lone working people to walk through tunnels. And consider risks arising from the tunnel lighting. If you provided lighting in tunnels, that may well be very good for the track staff, but first of all, what are you going to do if it fails? And second of all, what impact does that have on the visibility of the train crews going through the tunnels? So I don't think there are very many tunnels on heritage railways that have tunnel lighting, but certainly it's something that has to be considered very carefully. Right, we're coming towards the end of this presentation now. You'll be delighted to hear. So if you've got any last questions or queries or comments that you want to make, now's the time to make them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. 2 weeks from today, on what I'm pretty sure is the 31st of August, but it's certainly the Tuesday that's 2 weeks from today, I will do a workshop just like this, but it will be entirely me delivering to you my ideal PTS briefing, obviously apart from the practical element of it, but certainly the classroom element of it, to give you an idea of the PTS briefings that we've picked up from railways over the years. Some railways are very kind and they send in to me here at HOPS their SMS documentation for what the workshops are going to be, and thank you very much to those of you that do that. It is really, really helpful to see where what we've come up with matches or differs from what you've got, and where you've thought of things that we haven't, or vice versa, and including everything into the workshops and the templates to make a best practice scenario. So you can do that next week. You can watch the PTS briefing and you can steal whatever bits of it that you like, or feed in if you think that you've got other ideas about how the PTS briefing workshop could be improved. I think that might be just about it from me, and I'm very glad that I had the idea to break these workshops up, because I've been going for an hour and a half, and obviously I've only got through part 1 of 3 of the slides that I was planning to get through. I've got through part 1 of 3 of all of the SMS briefing material that I think we need to put into this track safety. So the next SMS workshop is on Tuesday the 31st of August, and it's going to be a PTS briefing. I hope that it's been useful for you. I can't see that any last final comments have come through that require my answer, apart from everyone saying thank you, which is very nice of you to do so. I think, oh, hang on. So there is one here. Sorry. It's from Phil. It says, if you are just going to the other side of the tunnel, then if there is an alternative route to take, use that, i.e. road path. Yes, absolutely. And that probably nicely comes back to the very, very first point that we made in this whole presentation, which is that we should only allow staff to be on the track if there is actually a legitimate business reason for them to be there. And if there is a path or a road that they can take, well, whether there's a tunnel or not, then unless they actually need to be on the track because they're inspecting it, for example, then we should expect them to walk around. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Next SMS workshop 2 weeks from today. I'll be there. I hope you will too. Please send in your comments, and if you want to, send me in your PTS briefing material that you deliver to your staff, and I'll do my best to include it. But apart from that, I will see you all again. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good night.